Are we ready to start, or should we give people a little more time?
Let me see what it looks like. We can give them a few more minutes.
Okay, thank you. Just tell me when you're ready.
Okay. It's hard to tell if everybody is back or not. I think we can get started, Dottie. I'll introduce you. Dottie Morrison, CDO at Keene State College. I pass it over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. The title of this panel is A Check Uncashed, Past and Present Projects for Reparations. And as we think about healing, the process of healing, not only as people of African descent, but for the entire country to hear, there has to be some way to repair some of the harm that was done as a result of this tragedy that we call slavery. We have to also look at the impact that it will have on future generations as well. And so it behooves us to come up with a way in order to come up with a way where we can repair some of this harm as we move forward and create a wonderful future for our children and their children and many generations to pass. We also have to realize we have to do our part as our ancestors did. Their mere survival was a testament to how important they felt it was for us to do things in the moment. And so it's our moment, it's our watch. So we have three amazing people who are taking this as a very serious moment to think of ways, to think creatively and dynamically about reparations. So instead of reading their bios are on the website. What we will do is I'll ask each of the panelists to take just about 30 seconds and introduce yourselves, and then we'll go into the discussion. Each person will speak about 10 minutes. So can you go in the order that we agreed on? I sent it in the text. So first person up, just take a few minutes, just a minute to 30 seconds to introduce yourself.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Davarian Baldwin. I'm professor of American Studies and founding director of the Smart Cities Lab at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. And the topic of my remarks for this morning will be the reparations movement in higher education. The reparations movement in higher education is something that we don't always think about centrally, but it will play a profound role in issues of repair, not just from a moral or ethical standpoint, but also from a socio-economic standpoint. And I want you to bear with me, come with me on this conversation to see why, and why even if you are not a student or connected to a campus, the issues around reparations in higher education is still central to your understanding or who you are as a US citizen and a citizen of the world. So after the social unrest of 2020, more colleges and universities have been pushed to acknowledge the history of their entanglements with various forms of white supremacy, slavery in particular, with works by people like scholar Craig Wilder, his amazing book, Ebony and Ivy. Schools are now coming out of their archives to rename buildings and create various forms of memorials, statues, and commissions that acknowledge the intimate relationship between ivory towers and the history of Black bondage. In just Maryland alone, St. Mary's College recently commemorated an arresting new memorial to enslaved people who lived, labored, died there. And Johns Hopkins University launched its Hard Histories at Hopkins project that discovered its own abolitionist namesake, in fact, owned enslaved people. It now seems, however, that university leaders are a bit too eager to concede higher education's ties to US slavery, arguably the most explicit form of white supremacy. pointing to a long ago slave past, has become almost reassuring because it allows schools to acknowledge their historical wrongdoings while celebrating how far they have come. But as I point out in my most recent book, In the Shadow of the Ivory Tower, how universities are plundering our cities, higher education's racial reckoning goes far beyond slavery. The Moral Land Grant Acts of 1862 and 1890 helped fund public universities that opened up higher education to larger segments of the nation. But it built out the endowments of state universities based on the seizure of indigenous land. The 1890 version extended the aid to former Confederate states, but provided extra funds to build separate and underfunded historically Black colleges and universities that continue to chase funding equity. In fact, just this April, Maryland was ordered to pay out a $577 million settlement to compensate for systemic underfunding of the state's HBCUs. And higher education's impact on racial inequality did not stop at the Mason-Dixon line. During the Great Migration, schools like the University of Chicago sponsored white neighborhood associations in areas around the campus to draft racially restrictive covenants that prevented the sale or rental of property to African Americans. In the 1950s, the same school, UChicago, organized a lobby of 14 urban universities to push for a change to the Federal Housing Act of 1949. They used federal money to demolish neighborhoods to buffer schools from growing Black populations with school buildings and research parks. This history of racial separation between wealthy white schools and impoverished brown neighborhoods has now been set. And so now schools take advantage of their property tax exempt status to build out profitable research parks and innovation districts. These spaces bring millions of dollars back to the schools in the forms of royalties for research sold on the marketplace. Not only does a school not contribute to property tax-starved city services for fire, public schools, road maintenance, etc., but their presence actually raises the property values for homeowners and renters in surrounding neighborhoods. And many times, these are communities of color or rural poor white neighborhoods. And so it's this reach and wealth of schools that make them a ripe target for reparations. In 2016, investigative journalists discovered that Jesuits sold 272 enslaved people in 1838 just to keep Georgetown University from going bankrupt. In the present day, students met directly with the descendants of those enslaved people and pushed for a $1 billion fund through the increased student activity fees of $27.20 a year per student in memory of the enslaved. A group of graduate students created the Reparations at the University of Chicago organization, otherwise known as ROC. They want UChicago to recognize its slave roots, but also compensate neighborhoods for the university's hand in building out restrictive covenants, pushing demolitions, and their hand in today's campus police profiling of Black and brown residents. Their demands range from increased coursework and faculty that focuses on Black life to a community board that oversees campus expansion projects in neighborhoods, and also the demilitarization of campus police. Right now, just today, I just got off a call because I'm organizing with residents in the Black Bottom neighborhood of Philadelphia, who are still suffering from university-led demolition projects at the hands of UPenn and Drexel in the 1960s. Just weeks ago, the university townhouses announced their sale to a developer, which would destroy one of the few sites of affordable housing in the area. However, in concert with the Black Bottom tribe, we just discovered that during the urban renewal policies of the 60s, residents from that period had protested and forced the universities to agree to build multiple sites of affordable housing throughout the area, which they never did. So we as a group today are fighting this effort at displacement as just the most recent move in a series of broken promises and breached contracts. This partnership is a part of the Black Bottom Tribe in concert with my own Smart Cities Lab, where I have joining with communities across the country to build out what could be called reparations work. As a part of these partnerships with communities that span from New Haven to Philadelphia to Berkeley to Miami, we are calling for school reparations from slavery, Jim Crow, and urban renewal practices. We're also calling for payments in lieu of taxes of the university tax exemption today. We call on schools to reserve a portion of their tax exempt endowments for community projects. We call for university medical centers to honor their mandate of indigent care that provides their tax exemption. We call on schools to attach a community benefits agreement to any campus expansion project that can include affordable housing mandates, zip code specific jobs or job training or scholarships or access to campus facilities. We watch schools throw away food daily and demand that they package the food into healthy meals for communities of need. Finally, we assess the failure of campus police to address the primarily white campus crimes of sexual assault and substance abuse. And we watch these campus police and their jurisdiction extend into our communities by engaging in racial profiling and a two-tiered system that absolves students and arrests residents. So these campus police, they fail on all accounts. And therefore we call on the abolition of campus police to be replaced with teams of preventative outreach and trauma care that meets the actual safety needs of both campus students and community residents. So right before our eyes, schools have used their wealth built on slavery, segregation, and urban renewal to become the biggest low-wage employers, landholders, healthcare providers, and policing agents in major cities and towns all across the country. And so we must instigate a forensic accounting of the comprehensive damage and then develop a vision of repair. In the end, I am not against higher education. I teach at a school. Schools have the capacity to do great things, but because their wealth and prosperity has been directly drawn from our misery, it is time to repurpose the buildings, reclaim the classrooms, the cafeterias, and the playing fields, and redirect the wealth hoarding to build out a truly beloved community that meets the mission of a higher education. Thank you.
Last week we had about 10 people join us.
Hello.
Kind of last minute, so I'll be curious to see if folks join us today. There's yeah, it's interesting that now that we're back in person, how dismal.
Thank you very much, Professor Baldwin, for your comments. Now we'll hear from Kathleen Anderson.
Greetings. I am currently the female co-chair of the New England chapter of the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations. And today I'm going to talk about a little bit of the history that has gotten us to where we are. So I have arranged a series of images that will help guide us through this session. So for 5 centuries, Euro-Americans, white members of the US society, have been the recipients of wealth and/or privilege coming from the African-American Black labor and social positioning. Now we African-American Black USers have earned reparations called for to repair the damages caused by the Euro-American white supremacy cultural systems. And Davarian went through a listing of those benefits through the educational system. starting with the enslavement and the Civil War and the emancipation. Black Americans, the formerly enslaved, freed enslaved people, were granted 40 acres and a meal by William Sherman, General William Sherman, the Union leader. But then that order was rescinded after Lincoln was assassinated, and President Andrew Johnson reversed that field order and granted those acreages back to the white farmers. In addition, the white farmers were granted reparations for their lost property, the Black enslaved people who were now set free. But as a result of the lack of labor, Black Americans were essentially re-enslaved through the sharecropper system and the convict leasing system. So if a Black person was charged with a crime of anything, they were re-enslaved in the convict system. Can you go to the next slide, please? So there's the problem. The US is founded on white supremacy. And it's creating problems everywhere, not just for the country as a whole, but definitely within the Black community. Again, Davarian mentioned ways in which the white supremacist structure has upheld financial benefit to white Americans through the educational system. Now it's time to reverse and to expand that system into the Black community. Next slide, please. So here's a look at a way that we can envision what has happened and what is happening now. So you see this series of cartoons. The top left says, "I'm doing this for your own good." He's using the Black body to uplift himself into a higher position. His second center slide says, "So we can go together forward, go forward together." The next slide, the next image, we see the white person climbing on the back of the Black person who says, "You're hurting me." And the next lower left, where the white person is almost has himself up to the higher ledge, and the Black person says, "This is enough, that's enough, I'm getting up too." And the Black person, the white person who's finally all the way up on the ledge says, "Well, I'm sorry that I was racist, but I know better now." And the Black person says, "Well, cool, give me a hand up, will you?" And the white person looks down at the Black person and says, "I got up here by myself, why can't you?" And typically that's how white Americans think of their positioning. They worked hard and they climbed up by their own bootstraps and they made success. And so they look at the Black community and say, "Well, why can't you?" Not realizing that all along they have used the Black body to enrich themselves. So in the 1930s, there was a New Deal established by President Roosevelt. And that New Deal costs the country about $50 billion, which today translates into $30 trillion. And the New Deal included a GI Bill and Social Security. The interesting thing is that although the law was not considered race specific, it did have racial undertones and it had discriminatory results. So Black soldiers, for example, were denied the access to the GI Bill in many cases. And the Social Security Act excluded and exempted people who were domestics or farm workers, which meant that most of the Black residents of the United States who were domestics and farmers were ineligible, were not eligible for Social Security. So the country has, in these instances, enriched white families to the deficit of Black families, and probably other families of color too, but right now we're just talking about Black Americans. In 1862, the federal government allowed and granted 160 acres to white immigrants. New immigrants arriving into the country were allowed and were granted at no cost to them 162 acres of land, which they could use to build wealth for their family. And right now, approximately 90 some million white families are the direct descendants and recipients of that wealth. Next slide, please. So this is another image that shows how our country has been established. It's in the form of a game, the American Dream game. Again, where white people say all the time, well, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps. I earned it. I worked hard and got to where I am. Why can't you? And without acknowledging the ways in which the period of enslavement, the Jim Crow period, the denial of voting rights, the segregation laws, the ways in which the civil rights bills, the civil rights have been denied to Black Americans. And so this is just another image to show that the system is set up against Black Americans, and it's time that we all work towards establishing reparations to repair this damage. Next slide, please. So again, here's another graphic that shows the period of slavery from 1619, roughly 1619 to 1865. The Jim Crow discriminatory laws and practices that divested wealth and prosperity from Black Americans, along with the redlining that cheated Black families from wealth through home ownership, and now the mass incarceration, which heavily impacts Black communities, starting with the drug laws of the 70s, and now moving into the present. Next slide, please. So at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, organized by A. Philip Randolph, Dr. King partially is quoted here, where he's saying, we have come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. And he's also quoted as saying that a society that has done something special against the Negro for hundreds of years must now do something special for the Negro. Next slide. There's another slide. I think that's the end.
That's the end.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So as a result of this discriminatory practices around wealth building, around the educational system, average white family has a wealth of $171,000, where the average African-American family's wealth, established wealth, is $17,000, $17,600. So Davarian talked about some forms that reparations program could take place in terms of educational systems. Other ways that reparations have been talked about, and this is through the National African American Reparations Commission, also the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, as well as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, have similar ideas for repair. And those include, again, education, funds for cooperative enterprises, health and wellness, housing, and particularly the reform of the criminal injustice system. Currently, the Black farmers, through attorney Greg Francis, have been awarded $1.25 billion for the farmers. That was in 2010. States across the country, the mayors, the National Mayors Association, the city of Evanston, Illinois, New Jersey legislators, California, Pennsylvania, New York, and Vermont are currently all working on bills establishing reparations in their areas. Right now, the HR 40, standing for 40 acres, put into practice by John Conyers in 1989, has now finally passed out of the House and is now being moved forward. So reparations is beyond due. Other cultural groups have received reparations. I mentioned the slaveholders who received reparations. Native Americans have received small pittance that they are owed, but they have received something. Japanese Americans for internment during World War II, also a small pittance, but they have received something. And the Black American population, upon whom the whole foundation of the United States has gained its wealth, has been denied reparations. It's time that we stand up and demand reparations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, and we will have time to ask questions a little later. So last but not least, we have Alan Brown, who will be our Alan Bean, who will be our final speaker on this panel. Sorry about that, Alan.
It's good to be with you today. My name is Alan Bean. I'm Executive Director of Friends of Justice, which is a criminal justice reform organization. I got involved in this work back in 2000 with the Tulia drug bust. We were able to overturn that. I lived in Tulia, Texas, up in the Texas Panhandle. And in recent years, we have also been involved with the Genus 6. We were the first people on the ground to bring that issue to the attention of the wider world, and the Curtis Flowers case in Mississippi. And so that was sort of my entree into the world of racial injustice. And so the question I'm going to ask is, why is there so much resistance among white Americans to the idea of reparations? Only 16% of white Americans support reparation payments to the descendants of American slaves. That's not as bad as it was in 2002, when only 6% of white respondents supported the idea. Among Republican voters, support for reparations hovers at about 5%, with 92% opposed, and those numbers have not changed a bit since 2002. Democratic voters are split on the issue, about 49% approve and 47% oppose, And this suggests that a solid majority of white Democrats continue to oppose reparations. White Americans, regardless of party affiliation, view reparations as either unrealistic, inappropriate, or downright evil. I have identified 5 interlocking explanations for this white resistance. The first, I think, is that reparation talk messes with the social boundaries of white people. Racism is a corporate sin, a communal affair. Typically, white folks live out their lives in the company of other white folks. Rarely, if ever, are we forced to listen to Black men and women speak painful words rooted in personal experience. Our social barriers protect us from that kind of talk. That's why we work so hard to keep those barriers in good repair. We can't engage honestly with the debate over reparations unless we move into strange and uncharted social territory, and frankly, we'd rather not. Social setting matters. I can't prove it, but I suspect the 16% of white Americans who support reparations have discussed the issue with Black friends or have been exposed to pro-reparations arguments in progressive media outlets. Most of these people live in urban or academic settings where you can embrace the idea of reparations without inviting harsh and quizzical stares. Red America doesn't want to talk about race at all, full stop. A Pew poll recently found that 52% of white Americans think seeing discrimination where it doesn't exist does more harm than actual discrimination. Among white Republicans, 79% feel that way. These folks live in bubbles in which an idealized vision of America is virtually worshiped and never is heard a discouraging word. It gets harder every year to break into that bubble, and this is by intention. Secondly, reparation talk messes with family pride. Some are guilty, Abraham Joshua Heschel once wrote, but all are responsible. The prevailing white opinion is that some were guilty, but no one living today is at all responsible. Most white Americans can recite a family history full of struggle and hard-fought success. For us, slavery and Jim Crow segregation belong to an ancient world that has no bearing on the present. In America, says Ta-Nehisi Coates, there is a strange and powerful belief that if you stab a Black person 10 times, the bleeding stops and the healing begins the moment the assailant drops the knife. The first Bean family set foot in America in 1749. We were Mennonite refugees from a religious oppression in Europe. Our family spent the first 7 years in Pennsylvania working as indentured servants. Being pacifists, they took a lot of flack from their patriotic neighbors during the Revolutionary War, and eventually they packed up their bags and moved to Canada, which is where I was born. Every white family has a similar struggle story. Those who grew up wealthy and just sort of had life handed to them on a platter, well, even those folks will tell you how hard their ancestors worked to get where they got. So when someone suggests that the descendants of enslaved persons should be compensated, we get our backs up. We think, you think we've got it easy, or you think that we've had it easy? Well, of course, life is hard for everybody. And so we don't realize the tremendous difference between the history of Black Americans and white Americans. Reparation talk, thirdly, messes with our religion. David Brooks, the sort of middle of the road commentator with the New York Times, notes that America is divided between old and young, rich and poor, urban and rural, male and female, immigrant and native born, Black and white. But there's something special about the Black and white division. The other divides are born of separation and inequality, Brooks writes, but the racial divide is born of sin. Reparations are about repair. The conversation is about fixing what you broke and returning what you stole. America is broken and white America broke it. This isn't because white people are inherently evil. It's because we own the keys to the corridors of power, and we have always owned them. To say, excuse me, this isn't, to say we rigged the game in our own favor would be a colossal understatement. We even transformed Christianity into a private transaction between me and Jesus. This brilliant move rendered issues like slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, or whites only New Deal spiritually irrelevant. A woman once told me that Black folks should thank their lucky stars that Providence brought them to America's shores. Only here could they feast on the glories of Western civilization and get a shot at eternal life. She had been carefully taught to think this way. It's a very common way of thinking, especially in the South. A man with a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other will use the Bible to justify the whip. You can't understand Moses when you think like Pharaoh. Fourthly, reparations talk messes with our patriotism. A child is to grow up a Christian, Horace Bushnell wrote in 1847, and never know himself as being otherwise. American patriotism works in much the same way. We want our children bathed in the mythology of American greatness from their first toddling steps, which is why Colin Kaepernick can inspire outrage simply by taking a knee during the national anthem. His sin is sacrilege. It has always been easier to worship a nation we have seen than a God we have not. For those living in the embrace of white Christian nationalism, as it is now called, reparations talk sounds like heresy. We must continue to believe that white America is exceptional, a glorious nation without spot or wrinkle. Admitting that we are a fallen people with blood on our hands messes with the narrative, and it is beyond the powers of most white people as a result. Finally, and fifthly, reparations talk messes with our politics. For decades, as it was mentioned in Kathleen's presentation, John Conyers, Democrat from Michigan, sponsored what he called the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans, HR 40. And when Conyers died, Sheila Jackson Lee, Democrat from Texas, carried on where Conyers left off. Every year, this proposal is referred to the House Committee on the Judiciary, and every year until this year, it has quietly died. HR 40 doesn't call for an up-down vote on reparations. It just asks Congress to consider the undisputed facts of history and determine a fitting legislative response. And yet there has been resistance, quiet but powerful. Knowing that HR 40 would be wildly unpopular in white America, until recently, the Democratic Party has never thrown its weight behind the proposal. Whether they will this year or not remains to be seen. They fold without a fight every time. I suspect white Democrats see it as a pragmatic decision. They want to prioritize proposals that actually have a chance of passage. Why focus on measures that are guaranteed to hook conservative backlash, they ask. Donald Trump did not invent white racial resentment. He just looked at the public opinion surveys and shamelessly fed white America what it wanted to hear. There's nothing new to his game. Trump just does it better. If we didn't understand what we were up against, now we know. So how can people of goodwill sponsor a productive conversation about reparations without driving white folks crazy and stirring up backlash? The debate must begin, as our first presenter suggested, on the local level. The seeds of racial justice can only take root in hospitable soil. Most white people will close their ears to historical fact. We know that, and we can't really change it. But we can engage with the 16% of white folks and the 3/4 of African Americans who are ready to talk. We can get a serious conversation going. and you never know who might be listening in.
Thank you very much to our three amazing panelists on you. But are there just any things that you'd like to share with the group right now? Any reflections? Any action that people are planning to take as a result of hearing some of the things that we said on the panel? Any actions you're thinking about taking?
Yeah, I was really encouraged by our group. We had about 9 folks in there, and a lot of folks are doing work around reparations. And so, you know, I encouraged my group, and I encourage anyone on the call, if you have a link to the work that you're doing, you know, share it with people so that we can continue to learn. Even if you're all over the country, it's really great to see and hear and be able to donate to that work too.
Thank you. I noticed that Angela Matthews has her hand up. So Angela, if you are willing to speak.
Sure.
Angela Matthews.
Not everyone had an opportunity to speak in our group, but what I was struck by is that every person spoke about what can I do, feet on the ground in my community. And there was a mention of New Hampshire being a little bit different from some of the other examples that we've heard about in terms of our rural nature and small communities and our level of diversity. I think that's what was being spoken to. But I'm always moved by the what can we do question and how repeatedly it came up in our group as wanting to make a difference where I am, in who I am.
Okay.
I'd like to answer that question.
Great.
I'd like to answer that question. What can white people do? You can write your senators, your legislators, and demand that they pass and support HR 40 and S40. Those are the Senate bill and the House of Representative bills around reparations. And you can organize your community to also write letters demanding that your senators and other representatives support the HR 40 bills that are in the House and the Senate. And you can demand that your community start looking at how it can support and create a reparations program for your community.
Thank you very much. Other panelists, do you have any suggestions? Yes, Professor Baldwin.
Yes, hi. I would just say, just to build off of what Kathleen pointed out, I would say that anybody can do forensic, and many of us when we get older love to do genealogy work. I spend many times in libraries next to senior folk who are doing their family genealogy work, and so we can start engaging in getting our elders and our children to do genealogy work on the histories of our towns and our neighborhoods, and talk about the relationships that these neighborhoods have to slavery, or to Jim Crow, or to segregation, or to current conditions of the displacement of immigrant communities in our own communities. And the reason why I say that is because this is being sponsored by a space in New Hampshire. And so I've had students from New Hampshire in my classes, and they would say, well, I'm from an all-white community. We don't have a race issue. And I say to them, if you live in an all-white community in America, the only way you can stay all-white is because you do have a race issue. So what are the institutional levers that have allowed your community to be all-white? So it just giving a present-day example, if almost every community has a Chinese restaurant and has ethnic foods, and even so-called American foods, if you go into the kitchen, most people that work there are not white. So what are the policies in place that allow your restaurants and your landscaping companies to be full of people that are not white, but those people cannot afford to live in your neighborhoods? That's a structural issue that's connected to issues around reparations. So you can do forensic accounting to talk about how your New England town was tied to shipbuilding, or was tied to refinery work that brought cotton or tobacco to these areas. And you can move all the way to the present, talk about how housing policy during the New Deal, which was racially restrictive, had an impact on making your neighborhoods all white. and preserving that in today where people can come and work in your neighborhoods, but can't live there. So there's a whole lot of research and forensic work we can do to begin then to start challenging the claim that, well, my parents didn't own these slaves. This is not an issue for me. I live in New England. This is not an issue for me. We can start seeing the connective tissues that show how we're all connected through slavery and through racial inequality. So I'll stop.
Yeah, I would
Thank
agree with
you.
that. I think most white Americans, and this is particularly true in the South, have very little idea of the history of our country. And I think one of the reasons that we have seen support for reparations jump even modestly within the white community and much more dramatically within the Black community, from about 55% to about 78% now, is because people are starting to talk about history. And they're not just doing it in universities. A lot of people online, in social media, there are a lot of conversations, especially among our younger people. They're far more aware of the tragic dimensions of our history than their parents and grandparents were. And until people get that, they don't really know what the fuss is about. And they're quite frankly confused by it. The current flap over critical race theory is basically an attempt to get people to shut up about history. Because even the most objective, sober retelling of the American story is going to rock people back on their heels because we have been shielded from it. And so I think that that's got to be part of the strategy.
Thank you very much. There's a question in here for Professor Baldwin, and I'll just paraphrase it, but how has your work been received at your institution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a whole chapter about my own school in my book. So let's be clear. I don't just point fingers outward. So that's just to be clear on that. But second of all, I actually met with my board of trustees on Friday, just this past Friday, to talk about my work. And there was a lot of nervousness and defensiveness in that conversation, but they were open to having the conversation. And now we're moving forward to figure out how we can build better. Because I've tried to talk about these things in their own interests, to say that, you know, the $70,000, the white family that can pay $70,000 a year for higher education, they aren't having kids. And so if you're going to survive into the 21st century, you need to lean into the communities that surround you. And that means repairing your relationship with them. That's a critical part of that. And so just even from a position of self-interest, repair work matters for white folks just as much as it matters for oppressed peoples. And so this is what we talked about, and we'll continue to talk about that. And who knows, it could all go left. I could say something that they don't want to hear. It could go left, but I'm having the conversation as long as they're willing to have it. And if they stop having it, I'm gonna keep doing what I do.
Thank you very much. Please check the chat. Some amazing resources are being placed in the chat box by various people in attendance. So please be sure to check that, what's in there. Tons of great resources around reparations, and the Manchester branch of the NAACP has made reparations a focus this year and has a committee working on it. So for those of you who are interested, the phone number is in the chat. 603, oh, it just went up, so, but it's in the chat. Any other reactions or reflections as you're taking all of this information in? So one question is, what does the repair, how does repair look? What would we know if we're engaging in the process of creating a situation where there's repair? And we know that that repair has a great potential of leading to healing. And not just those who were most affected, the recipients of, but also it could be very liberating for those people who were the descendants of those individuals who were the perpetrators. So it's a healing process for all of us, y'all, if we are able to do this. So how would it look? Any ideas about how it would look? Any reflections? That's a question in there. I did a little commentary to the question, but that's the question is, how would it look? Yes.
I'll be real brief. I think just one thing is that I'll tell you how it won't look. I think that because of a history of aligning like welfare with Black people, even though we know that white people are the greatest recipients of welfare, is the belief that reparations is a check. It is a one-time check, and it's money, and that's it. But reparations, and we talked about this in our breakout group, reparations is not a one-time transaction. It is a lifestyle. It is about realigning our values and our infrastructures of privilege and wealth and resource distribution so that they are more equitable and just. And if we have a system that is more equitable and just, that tries to, a triage approach, that you give resources to those who are in most need. We're not asking for equality where everyone's the same. We're asking for equity, where resources and opportunities are given to those who are most in need because of a history of unequal distribution to those in one other group. And so if we have a lifestyle that reorients ourselves in terms of wealth acquisition, resource allocation, health and wellness that is more equitable, and we move forward in that way, then I think we will be closer to, not have achieved, but we'll be closer to a reparations lifestyle.
Okay, so it's just not about what we do, it's how we do it and how we do it over a sustained period of time. Any other reflections on that? Kathleen or Alan, any insights you would like to share? I saw someone's hand go up, but
well, what I would like to say is that two references that come immediately to mind to help people. One is a book and a talk on YouTube by Sean Rochester. That's S-H-A-W-N, Sean Rochester. His book is called The Black Tax, The Cost of Being Black in America. And he gives in his talk and in his book an excellent foundation and understanding for the why of reparations. Another book that is, and also a video interview with the authors of the book From Here to Equality, and that is by William Darity and Kristen Mullins. From Here to Equality. Both of those are good resources for people to start looking at reparations and how it can take place. What are the many ways, not just a check, as Davarian said, not just a check, but it's a lifestyle that requires an adjustment on multiple levels in multiple areas.
Another good book is The Sum of Us by Heather McGee. It is particularly good for white people, I think, because it doesn't just address the fact that white people have enforced white supremacy and have held non-white people down. It also emphasizes the fact that this has hurt everybody. It's really crippled America. And so I think the response to the COVID crisis is similar in that people are refusing to get inoculated or excuse me, immunized. And I don't know why this resistance to the vaccine is so powerful, but I think it's a species of resistance that's very similar to resistance to anything that supports or undergirds the common good. If it doesn't help white people, we don't want to play. And so we have to start thinking that what is good for the least of these is good for the powerful. What is good for communities of color is good for white communities as well. That is not the way we've been trained to think. We're sort of in a kind of have a zero-sum mentality that if it's helping a certain group that is not my group, then it's hurting my group. And that nothing could be further from the truth. So that's one philosophical reorientation that needs to take place.
Thank you. It seems like someone with the screen name, because I wanted to make sure that you knew it was the screen name, Science Nerd, had a comment, and then Susanna P had a comment as well. So if your screen name is Science Nerd, okay, thank you.
Okay, I put a notation in the chat about the same book, From Here to Equality, and also some information about the site where I've been a volunteer. There's also a group, and I don't know, called Coming to the Table. And it was started by a Jefferson descendant. And basically it attempts to bring people together who are descendants of slaveholders and descendants of enslaved people. And the group, there are chapters in several places. There's a Northern Virginia chapter that I'm now part of. And I used to be part of the one in Chapel Hill, which is awesome. But it really provides opportunities for people to talk about stuff without everybody sitting around trying to guilt them out because of things their families did. Because some of us are descendants of enslaved people and enslavers, which is another issue that people don't talk about very much. Because I have like 3 cousins who fully acknowledge that I'm their cousin, but some of their siblings don't. And you know, it's just, it is what it is. That's their issue, not mine.
Thank you very much for making those points, because that's something that we don't tend to talk about, the complexity of identity and how it could play out within our families and within ourselves. So thank you very much for raising that. Susanna P.
Thank you, Dottie. I wanted to go back to the question of how reparations might look, because I heard this morning Martha S. Jones, a Black historian, who's got a new book called Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And in that interview, she spoke about her vision for something that we don't have yet in the United States in terms of a place we could aspire to go. And she described the situation in France, where they have both a monument and a day each year where they celebrate or acknowledge the crime of slavery and celebrate the end of slavery and acknowledge the tremendous cost this had on that nation and the world and the continuing issue that it is for everyone. And they actually pause and acknowledge. And we're so far from that it's hard to say, but that's a vision, and that's part of reparations. The whole public monument aspect that the trail has done a lot of work on, and we'll be talking about later in the conference, is all part of that. But I thought that was a really interesting milestone that we certainly don't have on our radar yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that as well. And I'm sad to say, but we've come to the end of our time. I've really appreciated all of the comments. But what I would like to do, if you just bear with us for like another 3 minutes, is I'd like to have each panelist just give any closing thoughts that you have for just about a minute apiece, just any closing that you might have as a result of the conversations you've been a part of with this entire group of participants. So whoever wants to go first, just go ahead. Take about a minute, please.
I'll just say thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with you all and for everyone to be open to the conversation. I would just reiterate some things that have already been said in terms of reparations is not a handout. It's not a gift. It's a realignment of resources that have benefited some to the detriment of others. And so even if you look at this from a purely capitalistic standpoint or a legal standpoint, when you have inflicted damages in the court of law, there is a place where you can make the claim for repair, right? For damage compensation. This is no different than that, but it goes beyond that. There is a moral and ethical component to reparations, because the blood and labor of not just Black people, but Black people centrally, has served as the lifeblood for the all the things we celebrate about this country. And it was done and it was harvested at a cost. And so in order for reparations to be fully had, the conditions under which today's prosperity has been plundered and extracted from certain communities must be realigned. And that's not going to take, it's taken us multiple centuries to get to this point. It's going to take multiple centuries more to even begin to balance these things out. So this is not going to be a quick fix phenomena, but we have to do what is right, because all of the ground of prosperity and excellence that we stand on has been built on a history of damage. And it's time to make those repairs. So I'll stop.
Thank you very much.
Yes, I will go. Thanks everybody for listening, and I am looking forward to all of you supporting reparations in the way that you can best do it. On a separate note, I'm part of a group of 14 artists, 7 Black women, 7 white women, who have come together to talk about issues of race. And we're having an exhibit at the Two Villages Art Society in Kentucky at 846 Main Street, Kentucky, New Hampshire. Kentucky. Also, it's, I think, Hopkinton. At any rate, the opening is tomorrow. I will be there along with a couple of the other artists. We have each chosen a word to represent our activity in our group. My word is reparations. So we have a collaborative wall of a 10-inch by 10-inch square that each of us has created. My piece will be there. So if you're so inclined and you have some time tomorrow between noon and 5, please stop by 846 Main Street in Kentucky, New Hampshire.
Thank you.
Well, I think one of the most important contributions we can make is to have something concrete on the table. For instance, as I told the group in the breakout session, my congregation which is primarily white. We have some African Americans and a lot of diversity among our children, but not so much that the older you go, the whiter it gets. But anyway, we are starting to look at our history, our complicity in white supremacy, and also the issue of reparations. And so, for instance, just in looking at the history of the church, I found out that we've had 2 pastors who were named after Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK. And that was considered a good thing back in the day. And so as we look at our history, we can start to get a feel for the national history. And then as we reach out to congregations of color in the community, in our sort of backyard, which we are also doing, we're starting to understand how they feel about it. And some of these conversations can be difficult, but I think we need to get people talking to each other across social barriers. We live in bubbles, we live in silos, and we got to break those down in little ways. We got to start where we are and be satisfied with small and circumscribed efforts, because you know, every individual can only do so much, but you have to feel that you're doing something concrete, and that's what we need to give people.
Well, thank you very much for bearing with us for a few more minutes. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Jerry Ann, and all of those at the Black Heritage Trail for this annual revival meeting. So thank you very much for the revival. I always feel revived and renewed as a result of coming in community, even if it's a virtual community, with people who are willing to ask the hard questions and to struggle through coming up with the difficult and complex solutions and strategies. So please continue to engage. We have a lot more panels, great panels, and please at 12:30 join the keynote address. So thank you very much and have a very good afternoon. And again, really reflect on what we could start doing at home. Thank you very much.